You wanted the best. You've got the best podcast. The hottest podcast in the world. The Chris Voss Show, the preeminent podcast with guests so smart you may experience serious brain bleed. The CEOs, authors, thought leaders, visionaries, and motivators. Get ready. Strap yourself in. Keep your hands, arms, and legs inside the vehicle at all times, because you're about to go on a monster education roller coaster with your brain. Now, here's your host, Chris Voss.
Hi, folks. Chris Voss here from thechrisvossshow.com, thechrisvossshow.com. Welcome to the big show, my family and friends. We're so certainly appreciative that you have joined with us today in the holy matrimony of the Chris Voss Show, the giant cult religion in the sky. It's not a cult. Don't start doing that, Chris. The giant podcast in the sky. 14 years, 1,400 episodes, 2 to 3 new podcasts a day of the most brilliant minds we can book on this show. Like literally, we only take the most brilliant of minds, and then there's me. So there's that. Anyway, guys, we're going to be talking about the UFC today and the story behind the UFC. You may have heard of it. It's a giant federation of some stuff that goes on. So we're going to get into it and find out what it means and what it's about and how it was built and how the UFC turned into a $10 billion industry. In the meantime, go to goodreads.com/Chris Voss, youtube.com/Chris Voss, linkedin.com/Chris Voss, over on TikTok, we're Chris Voss 1 and the Chris Voss Show podcast as well. See what we're producing over there. I'm talking to people daily, like I guess you're supposed to over there. I don't know, you're talking about stupid stuff. I will not dance on that. That will not happen. He's the author of the latest book that just came out June 20th, 2023, Cage Kings: How an Unlikely Group of Moguls, Champions, and Hustlers Transformed the UFC into a $10 billion is the B industry. And that's just one there. It's into a $10 billion industry. People are going to be double, tripling the billion when they search for it on Amazon. So don't do that. Michael Thompson is on the show with us today, and he'll be talking to us about his amazing insight research in the book. He is a writer in New York. His work has appeared in the New Yorker, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, Slate, Vanity Fair, the Daily Beast, Aeon, Forbes, Al Jazeera America, Adult, Talking Points Memo, Los Angeles Review of Books, Complex, the Paris Review N+1 Book Forum, The Believer, The New Republic, Kill Screen, The New Inquirer, and The Millions. And now he's reached the pinnacle of his career, The Chris Voss Show. Welcome to the show, Michael. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you for having me. Sorry.
There you go. I'm glad we could finally just cap off, just the pinnacle of your resume there.
Yeah, absolutely. I should have shortened the list. I was getting a little bored myself listening to all those. Like,
I don't think we have any
stop at 4. Right?
There you go. I don't think we have anybody from Slate or Al Jazeera America on. We should look into that and see what's going on there. So give us the .com so people can find you on the interwebs, please.
.com.
Mm-hmm. Or .net or, whatever, Twitter.
I largely just operate on a Gmail at this point. I've sort of given up having I have a portfolio site, but
okay.
I have a Twitter account that I never really look at or use that often anymore, but
All right. Well, best thing to do is just to go to the Amazon link on the Chris Voss Show and order up the book, and then you can send him you can tell him what you think of him on the review. There you
exactly.
go. Does that work?
Yeah.
Does that work good?
Sure.
So what motivated you on to write this latest book? And I think you have 2 or 3 books, don't you?
Yeah. Well, sorry. I wrote kind of a essay collection about like love and dating and stuff like 10, 12 years ago. And then I had an essay in an anthology about American cities where I wrote about the city I grew up in, Fresno, which coincidentally is one of the most fervent mixed martial arts fan towns, according to one recent audience survey. So the book had a couple of different sort of stages. Originally, I wanted to write a history of prize fighting across, a couple hundred years to kind of look at the way, how different sort of eras sort of gravitated to violence in different ways and how they presented it culturally. And then over the course of about a year and a half, that kind of whittled down. I got some very helpful suggestions from my editor at Simon and Schuster. It was like, why don't you just tell the history of one time and place instead of stretching it out across, all of these things? You might be able to go deeper if you just sort of focus a little more narrowly on just this time and place. And so, I mean, the UFC was the most obvious choice, in part because I'd been a fan my whole life. I was a junior in high school when the first one came out, and it kind of, every stage in my life, it's always sort of been there in the background. Partly because I was always interested in martial arts and boxing and fighting, and also partly because they were interested in people like me, my demographic. I was their target audience, and I was sort of curious about what made my generation, my specific age cohort, so valuable to companies like the UFC. Why? What kind of business were they building out of a kind of audience of people like me? What was the sort of mechanisms behind the scenes that made that work financially? So
there you go. That's interesting. Did you mention the span of time and the arc of generations? Because I grew up with boxing. I grew up with Muhammad Ali, and Frazier, and who did I just do an imitation of? I always forget his name. But I grew up watching ABC, Wide World of Sports, and
me too.
Crow. Why can't I remember? I can't remember the famous ABC announcer who, he was Cosell. Howard Cosell.
Yeah.
This is Howard Cosell. And I thought he was the greatest dude ever. And of course, watching those fights, the Muhammad Ali in his prime, just something else to behold. And then generationally, weirdly, my brother never got into it, but he got into a World Wrestling Federation, WWF.
Yeah.
I still to this day think it's real, or he thinks it's real. I think to this day, which may explain his who he votes for and as a president. And then you, as you mentioned, you kind of came of age under UFC. So it's interesting, kind of how that develops as time has gone by.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of back and forth between the worlds of pro wrestling and the UFC too. I think Josh Gross, who wrote the history of the Muhammad Ali versus Antonio Inoki fight, he sort of fished out of the archives, but apparently Vince McMahon Sr., Vince McMahon's dad, who sort of got the WWF off the ground and turned it into a juggernaut. In the 60s, he used to use the phrase mixed martial arts to promote the WWF and like pro wrestling. So it's sort of, it's an idea that's got a long history, and the Fertitta brothers in 2000, when they brought the company and took it over, they used a lot of the WWF at that time. It was pre-WWE. They used a lot of the legal framework for how that business was structured for like fighter contracts and just revenue modeling to see how they could make the UFC a success.
There you go. And your title of the book is How an Unlikely Group of Moguls, Champions, and Hustlers Transformed the UFC. Give us like a 30,000 overview of the book, if you would, please, and just kind of a top-down sort of thing, and then we'll get into the deets.
Yeah, sure. My glib way of describing it was kind of War and Peace for the tribal tattoos and cargo shorts generation of suburban men.
The cargo shorts. Wow. Shots fired.
Yeah. I mean, if you know,
if you know, you know.
If you know, you know. Yeah. It's a sprawling kind of story. It spans multiple generations. It starts in the 90s when the business environment was very different. The whole plan for the company was a very different plan than what we know of today as a UFC. But it kind of just, tries to chart and track the lives of both the fighters involved in the UFC and the people running the UFC, and how, in parallel, the company shaped each of their lives and ambitions and what they hoped for. When that's, Dana White or Bob Meyerowitz or Art Davie or, the Fertitta brothers on the sort of corporate side. And then on the fighter side, I picked 4 main fighters that kind of spanned the company's whole sort of history up to the sale in 2016. It's Randy Couture, Nick Diaz and his brother Nate, Ronda Rousey, and then Conor McGregor is sort of the big finish.
There you go. Do you get into Dana White much? I mean,
yeah, absolutely.
Kind of the guy that.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
He gets the last word in the book.
How, were they friendly to you? Did they give you any interviews or any space time?
The UFC cooperated a bit. They gave me a few interviews, and I went out to Vegas a few times to talk, kind of off the record, just about what the book was and what I was interested in.
Like, what are you writing?
Presenting. Yeah, to feel me out, and I got to visit the offices a little bit. And,
that office is massive out there, isn't it? That facility.
Yeah, I kind of described it in the book. In the epilogue, I sort of write about one of those trips. It feels almost like a military compound, like you're in a green zone or something. It's like a big sort of barrier around it. There's like a big 1/4-mile parking lot before you can get up to and then it's just this cube in the middle of nowhere. And it's out in the middle of nowhere.
Which is pretty much, I think you just described Vegas, actually. So
yeah, kind of, yeah. There's another book just about Vegas.
There you go. Yeah,
that could be the next one.
Of those, yeah. The parking spots of Vegas. What's interesting to me is you talk about the rise of this thing, and it went through a couple kerfuffles that almost seemed like it was going to kill it and put it out of business. And I think this is why books like yours in the story makes it much more salient and interesting, because this wasn't just like an overnight success story. It's like, hey, we're going to do this, and boom. At one point they started doing the fights, and you'll I'm sure fill me in better on this, but they were banned in many states. And how did that play in, and some of the details that you uncover in your book?
I think that's one of the interesting things I kind of tried to tease out in the first chapter a little bit, was kind of how small an operation it was initially. Like anyone that maybe has worked in the entertainment industry, like before I started writing, I worked in the movie industry for a while, and like, the way that sort of movies and TV shows are designed to be able to scale up very quickly for like a 5 or 6 week shoot and then just evaporate again into like a producer and an assistant sitting on a studio lot. That's kind of the world the UFC came out of, where, it was a very small, the company that financed it originally, or partially financed it, Semaphore Entertainment Group. They're a subsidiary of BMG, the big music conglomerate. And, their sort of idea was that they were supposed to find original pay-per-view programming. And, they had a pretty small staff, and they found Art Davie, who was pitching this idea for what would become the UFC. And they kind of just put it together in a matter of months. Davie had been working on it on his own for a couple of years at that point, but by the time he got their backing, it went, I think, within 7 or 8 months from them being interested. I think he had called them in March of 1993, and they targeted an October sort of live broadcast. And so the whole thing, it was a really small number of people and a really short period of time, and they just ran with it. And so they were not at the point of like doing exhaustive legal research or anything like that. They were just sort of like getting over every hurdle as quickly and simply as possible.
And it was interesting how big the pushback was, I think, when it first launched.
Yeah.
You see this with the establishment of, I lived in Utah during skiing when they finally came out with snowboards. And oh my God, that was heresy. And, they were getting banned and kicked off the slopes and banned from, skiing. And then, years later, they finally adopt to it. And I think, boxing was so big back then. The World Wrestling Federation, I don't know if they opposed it, but I believe it was the boxing commissions and stuff that were like, this is not going to fly. Is that how it worked?
Yeah. I mean, it initially started, and there was an ambiguity with a lot of boxing commission. That's why they launched in Denver, because there wasn't a commission there to interfere one way or the other. So they couldn't get approval or not. So, but as soon as people realized that's how they were operating, then a lot of states and a lot of local politicians, some just sort of cynically for PR wins, but others out of kind of a genuine moral conviction, really started to try and oppose the sport. But initially, the UFC had a number of early wins in court, because the courts would rule that because it was such a new sport, the laws sort of defining how athletic commissions operated, they didn't actually have the ability to oversee mixed martial arts, because it's, they're, the way their laws were written were about boxing, about, other sports. They don't specifically mention mixed martial arts or, cage fighting. So a lot of courts early on said, like, you don't have authority to stop this under the specific law that governs the commission. And they figured that pretty quickly. And that's when you had this sort of cascade of state legislatures sort of correcting that loophole pretty quickly. And then putting pressure on the pay-per-view providers. And I think starting in 97, that's when all the pay-per-view providers pushed the UFC off to kind of appease John McCain. And then, the only place you could get UFC from 97 to 2001 was satellite pay-per-view, which was like 20% of the amount of homes that you had with linear cable pay-per-view. So
and they really struggled. And then you have a quote from the book. Senator John McCain, once decried martial arts as human cockfighting. I told you in the pre-show, my friend at Club Access, Corey Draper, used to hold the UFC fights when they got banned everywhere. And Utahns loved it, man. They caught on to it really quick. And my models from my modeling agency used to be the model girls, the card girls or whatever. And I've got plenty of photos of that. I never even thought of that. But what was interesting was watching them, because I would get ringside because they were my girls. And so it was, you're like, hey, I get ringside. But I remember it was hard to deal with the violence level of it, because you weren't used to it. And I felt stuck in the mud. Like, Muhammad Ali boxer, there's something of class to it, which there probably isn't. It's two men beating each other to death. But I remember watching it, and I remember telling the joke that I've told ever since, that well, now I know what prison grape looks like. It's just the violence and men crawling around with each other on the floor, and just it seemed to be way more violent to me, and I think it is, than boxing. But it was hard to wrap my head around. I mean, basically, is what I'm saying. I had a hard time with it. I think a lot of people did, and I don't know what that means or how that's pertinent. But it was something that I think people kind of struggled. Maybe we had to come to an agreement with that as a society. Go, yeah, okay, let's let this roll.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's still some debate about whether it's more or less violent. The MMA people say it's less violent than boxing, because it's less about head trauma, and there's a lot of sparring is grappling sparring. It's not just striking sparring. It's more of a mix, and the gloves and allow you to transmit head trauma. It takes a lot more force with gloves on to knock someone out than with the 4-ounce gloves. I would, in the end of the day, I think they're both probably equally violent. I think the UFC was just a new form of violence that people weren't used to. And there was a sort of barbarism to, especially the early shows where, I kind of quote in the book that, people were pulling each other's hair out in the first UFC. And the commentator, Kathy Long, who was a world champion kickboxer, who was doing color commentary, was like, wow, you can see just tufts of hair falling down into the octagon there. That's not something you see every day. But that was legal too, and there was a period where groin strikes were legal. You had some absurd kind of moments of two guys just on the ground, just taking turns, just like walloping each other's crotches.
It's Fridays at my house.
Yeah, that's true.
Ask the wife. And when you really think about it, like you mentioned, it is a bit high-minded to say, well, it's more violent. I mean, I paid for the pay-per-view where I watched what's his face chew off a guy's ear. What was that fight?
Evander Holyfield, Mike Tyson.
Yeah, Mike Tyson. And that was a bit violent. In fact, I think Evander Holyfield probably got the brunt of that one. So they're doing this thing, and then they meet, I believe, the Vegas people, right?
So the original owner of the UFC, Bob Meyerowitz, was trying to get the company back on cable, sort of in a desperate push. And he was going all over the country trying to get athletic commissions to sanction it, and sort of undo some of the political damage that had come out of their sort of first couple of years of runaway success, where they were kind of making more money than they were prepared to, I think, initially even. And Lorenzo Fertitta was the youngest member of the Nevada State Athletic Commission at that time. And so he was one of the people that Bob Meyerowitz and a lobbyist he brought with him was trying to persuade to let the UFC hold events in Nevada, because he had been told by some cable operators that if he got a big state, a state that had a boxing legacy like Nevada, that was as respected as the Nevada Commission was, for whatever you take that for. If he could get that, something like that, then they would consider putting it back on regular pay-per-view and sort of save him from the satellite kind of limbo zone he was in. And that would turn the money pipe back on. It'd help him be able to start turning a profit again.
And tell us about the Fertittas, because I mean, was this a kind of a linchpin moment where legitimate money comes in and big money comes in and kind of legitimizes them, and that kind of helps move the needle?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's the big catalyst. So the Fertitta brothers, Lorenzo and Frank III, they are heir to the Station Casinos, which is the first major locals gaming casino in Las Vegas. Their father, Frank Jr., started it in the mid 1970s with the idea that this would just be a casino for local people. It wouldn't be a tourist attraction. It was off the strip. It was out in the middle of nowhere on Sahara Boulevard. And all it would be was sort of bingo, slot machines, some light table games, and just a friendly, low-key place for people to kind of let off steam. And it, over a few decades, it sort of transformed into a giant $1 billion a year business. So by 2000, which is the year that they took over the UFC, the end of 2000, that same year, Station brought in almost $1 billion. I think it was $980 million in revenue for the year. From, I think at that point, they had something like 16 different casinos around Las Vegas, all off strip, all in the sort of
all
suburbs.
Off strip, all local.
Yeah. And they really controlled it. So they had deep pockets, and they had even deeper access to credit and banking. And they had a lot of connections politically. And they had a lot of one of the people they wound up hiring later on came from the Nevada Attorney General's office. Another person they hired to help deal with athletic regulations was Mark Ratner, who was another member of the Athletic Commission in Nevada. So they had a lot of cachet with people that Bob Meyerowitz didn't. And sort of like I was saying earlier, that about how small an operation the UFC originally was. And that's sort of part of how they got in so much trouble, is that, they had more success than they were prepared to really deal with, sort of politically, legally, financially. It sort of just all happened all at once. And, they're trying to solve 7 different problems, big problems, when they're really only equipped to do, 1 or 2 at a time. But the Fertittas had money, they had capital, they had reputation that allowed them to deal with all 7 of those problems simultaneously. And they had money to keep going without having just financial crisis after financial crisis. In the interim, before they really, turned the company around, they were able to lose, $6-7 million a year. And it wasn't a threat to their livelihood. They could lose $7 million when they're making $980 million from the gaming business. That's not a sort of fundamental threat to their well-being, the way it was for Semaphore.
There you go. And it just goes through this whole arc, and now it's it's just huge, mainstream. They make a lot of money. What are some of the most more surprising maybe stories or teasers or tidbits you can give us, maybe that you found in the book that you were just like, wow, people are really gonna be mind blown when they read about this?
Yeah, that's a tricky question. I actually have to think about that for a while. Part of it because it's such a complicated story. I mean, one of the hard parts about writing the book was trying to condense the history of a company, which now is like 400 some employees big, not counting Endeavor and all the other, how to make that a sort of coherent vision. So, I mean, a lot of the things that I found most memorable were really like character moments. Here's what I actually had to cut this out of the book, but I spent some time with Nick and Nate Diaz's boxing coach, Richard Perez, who I think is just a great guy, and I love talking with him. But he's a guy that's, you know, he doesn't get a lot of notoriety in MMA circles, but he's such an interesting character. He was thrown out of his house when he was 14 because he was epileptic, and his father was deeply religious. So he thought when his son was having seizures, he was being possessed by demons. He was completely freaked out by it. So he kicked him out. And his father had also been a pro boxer, and he had brought up all his kids to learn how to box. He brought them to the gym with him, you know, when they were younger. So when Richard found himself out on his own for the first time, boxing was the only way he knew how to support himself. So he would make money by offering to be a sparring partner. He'd spar for $25 a session with guys in Fresno, which is my hometown. That's where he grew up too. And just, you know, as a teenager, completely alone, that was his one way of sort of not ending up homeless or on the streets. And then, you know, that led him to eventually being a boxing coach. But even that, you know, he coached world champions, but he never made enough from it that he was able to quit his day job. So when he met Nick and Nate, he was still working as a high school janitor and then just going to the gym at night to train fighters. And it's stuff like that, those kind of details, it's sort of like the human kind of circumstance that lead people into fighting, and what kind of characterizes that, the relationship people have over a lifetime in fighting sports, that to me was the most meaningful. Like that's the stuff that sticks with me after having gone through this whole 6-year process of reporting this stuff out.
There you go. Yeah, and then even with the Fertittis, they had trouble with that. There was financial issues for them when the fallout of, I think it was the 2008 crisis, where they've kind of overextended themselves. 2008 housing crisis, because I remember they had several projects under works for the station casinos. They were building, like, I don't know, station casino like 7-Elevens at one point, or I think it was projected. I remember I think it was the North Las Vegas one that got them kind of overextended, in trouble, I think, when they were building it.
Yeah, that had just opened when the collapse happened.
Yeah,
they had just gone public too, and they had gone private, so they'd had to buy back all their shares, and they took on a huge amount of debt to do that. And then they wound up right when the crisis happened. That was about a year before the real estate collapse, and so they they couldn't service their own debt, so they had to go into bankruptcy proceedings.
Yeah, crazy story. And somehow the UFC just keeps building through this all and just keeps going. I think Dana White survived a few different I don't know, moments, or I think sometimes there was something they either said or different things that happened. I know a couple of fighters have gotten in trouble. I think there's one in trouble right now. And
there's a lot of it.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting characters doing interesting things with maybe a little too much testosterone, or maybe some other things going on. But yeah, it seems like they just keep plowing through and keep growing, and it just appears there's no end in sight. In fact, I think it's technically bigger than boxing right now. Is boxing even still a thing anymore? I guess it is for lightweight and medium. I don't even care for lightweight medium. Like I said, I guess I'm an old guy who's on the lawn going, "Get off my lawn, kids." I mean, I still love the heavyweights, all that fighting. And when I see the little guys fighting, I'm like, well, that's cute. But I mean, people love it. So what do I know?
Yeah. I mean, it's a common theme in the UFC too. One of my best friends only watches heavyweight fights.
Yeah. So I don't feel so bad then. I'm not that old stick of a mud that, I mean, there's, if you grew up watching fucking Ali and Frazier and all the greats from back in that day, it was an extraordinary time to live through. It just and the fighting, when you've seen the Rumble in the Jungle, when you've seen the Rope-a-Dope, you know, and you watching what's his face spar just verbally with, you know, they were always arguing, the announcer from ABC Wide World of Sports, how it goes, so always arguing and sparring with Muhammad Ali. I mean, it's just a magical time of history, and the characters were just seemed larger than life. And you know, I mean, I could tell that the WF was fake. I have to. Sorry, did I break anybody's feelings? Did I tell somebody Santa Claus isn't real? So there's that. Anything more you want to tease out of the book, Michael, before we go and before I finish assaulting anybody who likes wrestling at this point?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not really a teasing kind of person.
All right. Well,
I like spoilers. That's my
like spoilers.
So I'll just tell you how it ends. Tell you the last line.
Well, I mean, technically, you got a couple books you can work on for this going on here and out there. I think, you know, Dana White's an extraordinary, interesting guy. Would you frame him as a consummate leader, visionary, entrepreneur, endless promoter? Is he really that dude? Can you really look at the UFC and say this thing made it because of him?
It made it in the form that it's currently in because of him. And I think it would have survived regardless. I think that's one of the sort of myths that gets told a lot, that
really,
you know, MMA wouldn't exist without UFC and Dana. And they were, you know, the Fertittas and Dana White were certainly central to MMA getting formed in the state that it's currently in. But you know, even when the UFC in the late 90s was going through its difficulties, Pride was massive in Japan. There was a massive global audience growing. That's part of what made it such an appealing acquisition target for the Fertittas. I think they knew they were getting an underpriced asset for $2 million. That,
$2
you know,
million.
Yeah,
I remember that. That's coming back to me. Wow, $2 million.
Meyerowitz offered him 50% for $1 million, and they said, "We'll take the whole thing for $2 million."
Wow!
But you know, part of what made that such a good deal is in Japan, you were having 10, 20 million people watch Pride events, and so that doesn't translate to American revenue per se, but there's still enough of a spillover audience and enough of a kind of cultural memory. And even separate from the UFC, you had this whole new generation of regional fight promoters, like your friend you're talking about.
Yeah.
King of the Cage was going on in California. IFC had been going on. IFC actually had the first free televised MMA event, I think, in all the United States, which was a broadcast on a local affiliate in Alabama in advance of one of their shows down there in, I think, 98 or 99. But there was this, there's a whole host of people working on these sort of knockoffs and follow-ons from the original UFC success. So there was a real churn there in the market, and things were catching. It was slowly kind of building and bubbling up. It was just whether that would have led to, the state of MMA today that we have, that we're all familiar with one unified sort of coherent brand, which is something you don't have in boxing. That's part of, one of the struggles that boxing has had, is sort of like, there's nowhere to go to follow a coherent, narrative about who's fighting who and why. So, that's what I wanted to really sort of write about in the book, is not whether they sort of saved MMA, but how their efforts created MMA that we know today in the particular form.
There you go.
Yeah.
Maybe it'll be as big as that new thing they have out where you slap each other in the face. Have you seen that thing?
Yeah.
Is that part of UFC? Are they the ones that are back there?
That's the Fertittas and Dana White.
Damn, man.
I believe John Mulkey is involved, as the old CFO from the UFC.
I've started watching some of those things, and I'm just like, holy crap, that looks like the football people are like, wow, that's more, who's the Pittsburgh Steelers old quarterback from the 70s?
Terry Bradshaw.
Terry Bradshaw. I mean, he's had like, I think at least somewhere under 100 concussions, I think, in his lifetime. I don't know. He doesn't remember either. But you watch that and you're just like, that looks like a concussion problem the NFL had. I don't know, man. But whatever, man. Whatever works, man.
Yeah.
I guess.
Well,
I guess I don't know. There's a few people I think I'd like to see do a slap fight, at least with me and my enemies. Evidently, Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg have announced they might do a cage fight.
Yeah, I mean that's one you'd rather see them do a slap fight than a cage fight. Right? I mean, I would pay to not watch them.
Yeah, because they're just going to pull each other's hair pretty much, and I don't know, take swipes at each other with their HP calculators or something. I don't know what goes on there. Pocket protectors or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
make fun of your ability. I don't know. Maybe they'll just take turns going in deep diving submersibles that aren't certified and see how that works.
Yeah.
There's
that was the whole celebrity boxing from the early 2000s. If you remember, Fox used to play like Tom Arnold, I think. And the Screech, what's his name? Dustin Diamond and Tanya Harding do. I forget who the matchups were, but yeah, there was a period where you
think it was Tanya Harding in a kneecap, I think, versus kneecap, something like that.
There's a whole series.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. You know, anytime I see cage fighting, I just think of that movie, Thunderdome. You know, 2 men enter, 1 man leave.
Yeah.
God bless that show. So thank you very much for coming on the show, Michael. We really appreciate it. It's been a lot of fun, and I think people are really, of course, going to join the book because there's so many fans for this too as well.
I appreciate it. I hope so.
There you go.
Worked very hard on it. I hope
there you go.
Like it.
So we don't have a .com or a plug. So people just click the link on the Chris Voss Show. You'll see it, of course, posted everywhere. Order the book where fine books are sold. Cage Kings: How an Unlikely Group of Moguls, Champions, and Hustlers Transformed the UFC into a $10 billion industry. What an incredible story. Thanks so much for tuning in. Go to goodreads.com/Chris Voss, youtube.com/Chris Voss, linkedin.com/Chris Voss, and find us over at TikTok at Chris Voss 1 and the Chris Voss Show podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Be good to each other. Stay safe. We'll see you guys next time.